In this video we will dive into React unit testing and end-to-end testing. This video is a part of my full React testing course and you can find the link to it in the description box below. But if you just want to start with some coding challenges, let's jump right into it. Welcome to my course about React testing. It's so great to have you here. And in this course you will learn everything that you need to know about testing React applications. We will start with an empty folder and learn how to test React with unit testing and end-to-end testing. You will learn how to test components, context, custom hooks, use effects, API calls, and even Redux reducers and components. We will use Vitest and React testing library as our testing tools for unit tests and Cypress for end-to-end testing. In this course you won't find any dry documentation, only tasks for the real projects. Additionally, we will have a real project that we will cover with unit and end-to-end tests, so you understand how to do it right. By the end of this course, you will be able to test React project of any complexity. Who am I? My name is ekaterina and I am a web developer with more than 13 years of experience, as well as a professional instructor with various courses regarding different web technologies. I did my best to put all my knowledge inside this course and I want to share it with you. So welcome on board and let's get started. In this video we need to understand why do we need testing at all, and here we are not talking only about React, but any language or framework. So when we start developing a new application, we don't need any tests, we simply start writing code and everything is green and fresh. But after some time, you might see that a lot of code is being broken again and again when you are changing it or introducing new features. And it does not always happen because the team who is doing the project are bad developers. It happens simply because it is difficult to do new changes without breaking old stuff. You might not remember all cases for specific feature. If you are getting a new developer, it might happen that he thinks that some code is not needed and he will simply remove this code. And at some point you will see that you spend more time on fixing bugs than implementing new feature. This is exactly a good point to think about testing your application because it will solve all these problems. Why that? Because essentially when we have some feature and we cover it with all possible test cases that we can imagine, it is almost not possible for this feature to break. Obviously there can be a case that we didn't cover, but we can always add it later when we find a bug. Additionally to that, if a new developer who does not know project really well will remove some code and run tests, he will see that tests are red and this code is needed. I'm sorry for interruption, but I just want to let you know that I have a membership here on the channel that you can join to support me. It will give you access to the new videos earlier, emojis and priority replies to your comments. Now let's jump back into the video. And from my experience I can tell you that we had in some projects exactly these problems, and after we introduced just some basic tests, we get much less bugs and our performance was much higher. And additionally to that, it is much easier to implement difficult features with tests. Why that? Because you don't really need to check every single case inside browser. While clicking through your UI, you can simply run your tests and check inside different test cases at once. Which actually means tests are needed, but they are not a silver bullet. You should not write any tests when you just started to implement your project. Why that? Because you will for sure change this code later. This code is not stable yet. And this means that you will update all these tests later or you will throw them away. Testing needs time to be supported. This is why it doesn't make sense to do it at the beginning of your project. I just want to remind you that if you are looking for the source code of the course, you can find it under every single video where it makes sense, which actually means if we wrote some code inside the video, you will for sure find the source code in the description box below. In this video, we must set up a project where we will write our test. And I didn't even create a folder yet. This is why let's do this now. What we want to use in order to generate our project is a Vite tool. If you don't know what is Vite, as you can see here, this is the official website, and Vite is a next generation front-end tooling, which actually means it can generate for us a project with a web server, hot mode reload, importing all our files correctly, and so on. This is an amazing tool which I highly recommend to use if you are developing plain JavaScript, TypeScript, React with TypeScript, Vue, Svelte, and much more. And if you already have some experience with React, you probably heard about Create React app. And you might think, okay, but why we are not using Create React app in order to create a React project? Create React app is an older approach which is not often updated nowadays, and it is quite slow in comparison to Vite. But nevertheless, if for some reason you want to use Create app, you can certainly generate a project not with Vite, but with Create React app. But in this course we will use Vite because it is much simpler. But before we start with installing Vite, I hope that you already installed on your machine Node.js, and if you don't, then you must jump on the website nodejs.org and download here Node. And I highly recommend you to always use LTS version because it is more stable. You simply download it, install, and then inside console you can write node -version and check what version do you have. I have here version 18, it will still work just fine, but you can use LTS like 20, then 21. If you watch this course in the future, it will work just fine. Now we must generate a Vite project on our machine. We don't really need to install anything because we can use Vite through npm. We can write here npm, and we're getting npm because we installed Node, create Vite at latest, and here will be a name of our project. In my case, I want to write here React testing course. I'm hitting here enter, and as you can see, we're getting the questions. Do we really want to install Create Vite? Yes. And now here we must select our project. As you can see, it supports lots of stuff, but we're interested here in React. Now here we can select if we want TypeScript, we don't. This is where we can select just pure JavaScript. I'm hitting enter and our project is ready. We must jump inside this folder and call npm install. After installation, we can call npm run dev in order to start our server. I opened this project and this is how it looks like, Vite plus React, and here we have a counter. This is obviously not what we want, this is why let's look on the files. As you can see, I opened the file tree inside VS Code and here how it looks like. Most importantly, here is our package.json with Vite and React. Here we have our index.html and div.id root where our React project will be rendered. And here is source main.js6 is the file which will be loaded. This is why let's open our source main and clean it a little bit. We don't need here index.css, I will remove it, and let's remove this file from here. After this, let's look on our app. We don't need all this stuff. This is why I will remove everything from the top and the whole content inside our markup. I just want to render here a div app, and let's remove everything from here. Now here I want to rename this to const because I prefer arrow function, and our app is ready. We don't need this file app.css, let's remove it. And also we don't need our assets, so I will remove this folder also. So our project is completely empty and we see inside browser our app, which actually means we successfully prepared our project to start implementing stuff. The last thing before we start that I want to mention is the editor that you want to use. If you still don't know what editor is better to use, I highly recommend you to look on VS Code. This is the most popular editor in the world to write JavaScript or TypeScript. It is completely free and it works on all operational systems. So you can simply jump to codevisualstudio.com and download it here. It has syntax highlighting for JavaScript, TypeScript, built-in terminal, it can prettify your code and much more. And when we're talking here about prettifying, I highly recommend you to install Prettier inside VS Code. What does it mean? When you are writing your code, you typically can intend it in any way, but then you can simply save your file and all code is perfectly intended. And even if you missed a semicolon, Prettier will do that for you. Prettier is opinionated code formatter, which actually means you almost don't configure it at all, you just install it as a plugin inside your editor, and then on save it will format your file. And it supports JS6, JavaScript, TypeScript, HTML and CSS, which actually means we can focus on writing our code and not on intending our code correctly. Again, VS Code and Prettier are not mandatory for this course, you can use any other editor that you want, but it will make your life simpler, especially if you are a beginner. In this video, we start the chapter about unit testing. This is where we must answer a question: what is unit testing at all, and why do we need to use it? As you can see here, I opened the Wikipedia website to show you what is unit testing. In computer programming, unit testing is a software testing method by which individual units of your code are tested, which actually means unit testing is something where you are testing small chunks of your code, like maybe your function or your React component. We are not testing here the whole website, where user clicks on some buttons and something happens. Unit testing is more about testing your code than the whole finished website. The question is, why do we need to do that at all? Because first of all, unit testing is extremely close to your code, which actually means you are testing your code, not the website. You are testing your specific feature and all the cases of this feature, so you are sure that it works correctly. Additionally to that, with unit testing, it is much easier to test all your test cases of the feature because you don't need to console log something in browser or click to check if it's working correctly. You can simply cover all the cases with unit testing and see that it is green. The second important point is that unit testing is about testing your units or your small functions or small components in isolation, which actually means we really want to be sure that this specific part of our application works correctly. We don't test a huge chunk of code, and it is extremely beneficial because even if you don't have any testing inside your application at all, you can simply start with a small chunk or small component and test it, and you are making sure that that specific component won't break. And then you can continue to improve more and more components with unit tests for every single one of them. In this video, we must set up our testing environment. What I mean by that, we need a test runner and something to write our tests. And essentially, when we're talking about testing JavaScript, we typically have just two possibilities. We're either using Jest, which is a really popular test runner, or Vitest. And in this course, we will use Vit, and there is a specific reason why. We generated our project with Vit tool, and Vitest is a tool from a same author. And the main idea is that Vitest uses underneath Vit, and it is much easier to set up your testing environment with Vit, and they are playing nicely because you are building one on top of the other. And if you for some reason think, okay, I don't really want Vit, I want Jest, this is totally fine. You can just follow this course because the code of Vit is 99% the same like Jest, and you can easily switch later to Jest if we need to. But it is not all. We won't use plain React and Vitest in order to test our application. This is not enough because it is not comfortable to test React without any helpers. And the most popular library to fill this gap is called testing library. As you can see, the official website testinglibrary.com, and the main idea is that you are getting lots of utilities for testing, which you can use to simplify working with it. And as you can see here on the left, these are all frameworks which are supported, so it is not only React, but also Angular, Svelte, Preact, Cypress, whatever. We will focus here only on React. This is why we must configure Vitest plus React testing library. And it is important to mention that React testing library is the most popular solution to write tests for React. Previously, we got a library which is called Enzyme, and if you are looking for testing React application, you can find lots of tutorials which are still using Enzyme. You should not use it because it does not support the latest React at all, and people are not writing tests with it nowadays. As you can see, here is the official GitHub repo of Enzyme, and you can see here that its adapters are written for React 16. This is an extremely old version. We don't want that. This is why our focus is React testing library and Vitest. This is why we must jump inside console and install all our dependencies. First of all, we will install everything with prefix -d, which means dev dependency, because we don't need testing for production. First of all, we need here our Vitest library and JS DOM. This is a special utility to test DOM inside our tests. Additionally to that, we need add testing library /jest DOM. Then we need here testing library /react, and testing library / user event. So as you can understand, testing library React is for testing React part, then just DOM is to test DOM, and user event is to test events in the UI. And here I missed a word install. We successfully installed all dependencies. Now let's open our project. Our first step is to jump inside package.json, and here after preview we want one more script which will be test, and here we're calling Vitest. And as you can see here, we're getting all our dependencies like Vitest, testing library, and so on. This is why our next step is to change a configuration of Vite. Just to remind you, Vite is our project generator with web server, and here in the root we have viteconfig.js, where we can tune it a little bit to set up Vitest. As you can see here, we already have a plugin for React, and now here we need a section regarding testing. We can provide here globals true. It is not mandatory, but it allows you to write, describe, and init globally without imports, just like you are doing with Jest. After this, we want to change our environment to JS DOM. This is exactly the library what we installed. And the last one here is setup files, and here will be our path test/setup, which actually means here we're telling that we have a special file inside tests folder with a setup. This is why here let's create a new folder. We can name it tests, and inside will be just one file, setup.js. And here is what I want to paste inside. This is our whole configuration, and this is the setup of the tests that we need. Most important line here is this. It is importing testing library JSDOM Vitest. It will register correctly testing library together with Vitest and JSDOM. Additionally to that, we have an after each block. And if you don't know how we're writing our test, you will see in the later videos. But the idea is that every single test starts with the word it. And we can group several tests with word describe. Additionally, we have after each, and actually this code will be called after every single test. The main idea is we don't really want to write this code inside every single test file. This is why we're writing it in our setup. So inside our after each, we're calling cleanup. What is cleanup? As you can see, it unmounts React trees that were mounted with render, which actually means it cleans our test after testing. After this, we have v.clear all mocks. It clears all mock stuff that we will write later. And we will talk about mocks a lot in the later videos. With that being said, let's write our first test. This is why inside source I want to create a new file and name it utils.test.js. The main point is that we must write this test postfix for all files that we want to get inside our testing. And let's write here the most simple test. Typically we are starting with word describe, and as you can see I'm getting auto import from Vitest. And this is the main difference between Vitest and Jest. Inside Jest, describe and read are global. Inside Vitest by default you need to import it on the top. And I really like this idea because you clearly see what you are using and it is not some global stuff. So inside describe we must provide a name of what we're testing, and typically we will write here at least the name of the file. So we're testing here some utils, and as a second parameter we're getting a function where we will write some tests. Which actually means this is not a test, describe is just a grouping of our tests. Now inside let's write our first test with word it, and as you can see again we're getting autocomplete from Vitest, and here we can write any name of our test about what we're testing. For example, it checks that 1 equals 1. Obviously this is not a meaningful test, but we're testing if our setup is correct. As a second parameter we're again providing an empty function, and inside we can write some expectation. And we're writing an expectation with the word expect, and then in round brackets we're providing what we actually expect. For example, expect 1 to equal, and here will be 2. This is how all our tests are looking like. We're grouping them with describe, and we're writing multiple it tests inside our describe. I can write like this, and we have 3 different tests. For our check, we don't need that. We simply want to check if 1 equals 2. How can we run our test? We can just write here npm run test, and as you can see, it starts Vitest. And what we are getting here is a fail. As you can see, our error, assertion error, expected 1 to deeply equal 2. And here in green, we are getting what is expected, and in red, what we received. Inside our code, we expected 1, but received 2. And here we're getting exactly the line inside our test where it happens. You can see here where your problem lies. And additionally, as you can see, Vitest starts directly in a watch mode, so we don't need to do anything. With every single file change, you will see changes in tests. So now let's fix our test. We want to write here expect 1 to equal 1. As you can see now, it is green and we're getting this nice structure. First of all, we see what test was rerun. And here is a path where testing source utils test.js, and here utils is exactly the name that we wrote here in the describe. This is why you need meaningful names to understand what tests are passing. And here we have the name of our test. It checks that 1 equals 1 and our one test passed, which actually means we successfully set it up Vitest and we can continue with our course. In previous video, we set it up our Vitest and created our first test. Now we are starting with some real testing, and first of all I want to show you how to test simple functions and helpers. This is why here as an example inside our project, inside source, I created a file utils.js. Here I have just a single function range, where we're passing inside two parameters, start and end, and we're getting an array of numbers from start number to the end number. And the goal of this video is to cover this function with tests. I'm sorry for interruption, but I just want to let you know that I have lots of advanced courses on different web technologies where we create real applications and prepare for the interviews. You can find the link in the description box below. Now let's jump back into the video. So let's jump inside our utils test.js. This is exactly how we typically will create our stuff. We have our file, for example, utils.js, and we're creating a file with the exactly same name but with suffix .test. This is what we already created, and here typically we're naming the main describe block like the file what we're testing. For example, in our case, we're testing utilities, and we can later create here like 10 different functions. This means that here inside utilities, we will write tests for all these functions. But this is not really convenient because all our tests will be mixed for all these functions. We don't want that. This is why inside our describe, we can create one more describe to group our test cases for specific function. In this case here we can say, okay, we are testing our function range, and now inside this describe we will write all our its regarding range function. Then on the bottom we can create another describe for another function. In this case we have a nice structure. And here we want to write several tests in order to make sure that our function is working correctly. This is why here let's write something like it returns correct result from 1 to 6 range, which actually means we are providing as a start 1, as an end 6, and we must get a correct result. This is why here inside it, first of all, let's get some result. So here we just want to call our function range. As you can see, we imported it from utils, and we want to pass here our start and end, and it will be 1 and 6, which actually means in the result, we're getting our array of numbers. Now we can write that we're expecting our result to equal, and here I want our test to fail. And this is extremely important point to remember. If you are writing test, you can't be sure that your test is correct, because you will see it is green, but you are not sure this is exactly what you are testing. This is why it is completely normal to write here expect result to equal 1. We know this is not true. Let's look here in the console. We're getting an error, and here on the top we can see our array from 1 to 5, and here we have an error that our test failed. And essentially this output is completely correct. We want to get an array from 1 to 5. This is why here we can write that it must equal an array 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it does not include our end. As you can see now, our test is green, and we have a nice nesting that our file is utils, then we're testing range function, and here are all our test cases. Essentially, this might be already enough to test a function, but it might be a good idea to add at least one more test case for some other numbers to make sure that the function is working correctly. we can simply copy-paste this test case and change numbers. Let's say that we are checking here numbers from 41 to 45. We must change here our range. It will be from 41 to 45, and I'm just saving because I want my test to fail. As you can see, we expected numbers from 1 to 5, but we received 41, 42, 43, and 44, which is exactly correct. This is why here let's update this array to the correct one. It will be 41, 42, 43, and 44. Let's save this and look again. As you can see, our tests passed, and this is exactly how we're testing simple functions or helpers. And realistically, it doesn't have anything to do with React at all. You can test JavaScript just like this. You simply import in your test a function that you want to test. You understand this function does not have any side effects. You simply provide there some parameters and you are getting the result. And then you are calling it inside your test. You are getting some result and you check with your expectation and equal if the result is correct. In this video, we start testing real React components and we want to start with something simple, and this is why I prepared for us an error message. As you can see here inside source error message folder, we have an error message component, and this is how it looks like. So it is just a React component where we're getting a prop message inside and we're rendering it on the screen, which essentially means if we don't pass a message, then we're rendering something went wrong. But here is a problem. When I'm hovering, we're getting an error message is missing in props validation. And this is ESLint problem. Realistically, I don't want to create prop validation for every single component. This is why I would like to disable this rule. Inside root, we have ESLint CGS, and here are our rules. And at the end, we can add a new rule, which is React/prop types, and we set it to 0. Let's jump back, and we don't have any error. So our next step is to create here a new file, and it will be error message.test.jsx. Now here we're creating describe just like we did previously, and here we typically write in the name of the component that we want to test. In our case, it is an error message. Let's write a callback inside, and here we want our first test. For example, it renders default error state. What does it mean? If we didn't provide anything inside our component, it must render this default message something went wrong. How can we do that? In order to render a component inside a test, we're using a render function. As you can see, it comes from testing library React. And inside it, we simply need to throw the component that we want to test. In our case, it's an error message component. This line is enough to do this rendering. What I want to do afterwards, I want to write screen.debug. But most importantly, you must import a screen from testing library React. So what screen debug does? This is an amazing tool to debug what you rendered inside your component. Essentially, inside our unit tests, we don't see on the screen what markup we rendered inside the component. Let's look in the console now. As you can see, nothing changes and we don't see that our test was picked up inside our testing suite. And the problem is here that I didn't name the file correctly. It should be test.jsx. Now, as you can see, this file is visible for Vitest, and we're getting here an information. So here is our source error message text JSX, and here it renders default state. This is our test. And what you can see here is our markup. This is exactly what we rendered with screen debug. And this is amazing because inside our tests, we obviously want to see what we're rendering so we can test it. And when we see here this markup, we can just understand, okay, we rendered here the default message, something went wrong, and this is exactly what we want to test. So now I want to remove screen debug. It was only for debugging purposes. We don't need it in our test. And after this, we want to find our div element and check what content we have inside. Just to remind you, here we have just a single div. And you might think, okay, we must find this div and get a message inside it. But this is a wrong approach. It is not recommended to use divs, some classes, or some attributes to find your element. This is all wrong. The only thing that I recommend you to use is data test ID, which actually means here on our div we can write data-test ID equals, and here is any string. for example, message container. What does it do? It creates an attribute on our div, and for our component it doesn't really make any difference. We simply ignore this data test ID. This attribute is only for our unit test, so we can easily find this element inside our test. So it is an important point. We don't want to use some generic classes or generic tags like a div. We want to use always data test ID, which actually means you should not learn any getting functionality of React test library. You simply need to use only one of them, and this is getting the element by data test ID. So here you can write expect, and inside I want to write screen. And again, we're importing screen from our testing library .get by test ID, and inside we're providing a string message container. And now after this we can write to have text content, and I want to write here a string foo. So what we're doing here, this thing will find our DOM element. Now we're throwing this inside our expectation, so we're throwing our DOM node inside expect, and we're checking that it must have inside the text foo. Again, I didn't write there a string that will pass the test. I want the test to fail. Let's have a look here. We're getting an error expected element to have text content foo, but received something went wrong. This is totally fine. This is exactly what we wanted to know. Now here I am passing that it must have a text content, something went wrong, and our test is green. So most importantly, we're using screen get by test ID if we need to find the element by our data attribute that we created. You should not use here screen.get by role, text, title, alt text, whatever. This is all not correct. Just use here test IDs and you will be golden. Another test that we must write for our code is that we can render correct message when we're passing it inside. This is why here I will fully copy-paste this it and just update it. So it must render a custom error state. And what we're doing here, inside our error message, we want to pass a message. For example, email is already taken. So as you can see, render function and this React testing library allows us really easy to render our component and provide any props inside, like for example our message. Now here I want to just check what we're getting inside console, and here as you can see we received email is already taken, but we're waiting to get something went wrong. This is exactly correct because we passed inside our message, and now this text inside that we're rendering is email is already taken. Let's have a look. Our test is green, and this is exactly how we're testing the basic components. So now you know that we're using render. In order to render a component, we can pass some props inside if we need, and we're using screen get by test ID when we need to check our element. And here we can use lots of different functions, and one of them is to have text content, which is extremely useful. In this video, we will test more difficult component. As you can see, I prepared here a pagination component inside source pagination directory. And this is the component where we're getting a total, limit, current page, and select page props. We're calculating at the beginning pages count that we have and the pages array that we want to render. Now inside our markup, we're rendering this pages array. And here we have a non-click event select page, which is exactly our prop. Now here is an important part. I already wrote here data test ID page container because this is what we need for our test. Realistically, before tests, we will simply remove this data test ID, and this is our component. And the last thing that we have here is an import of range, which means we have here a dependency and it is external. Just to remind you, inside our error message, we didn't have any dependencies, but here we have it and we will talk about it later. So let's cover this component with tests now. I want to create here a new file, pagination.test.gsx. And here, as always, we're starting with describe block and we're covering our pagination component. Now inside here, we need an it. And here, let's write that it renders correct pagination. So what we want to do here, we want to render our component by passing there all correct props. This is why here we need to use a render function from testing library React, and we're passing inside our pagination component. it is not enough like this. We must pass inside all our props. So here, first of all, total. This is the total amount of articles, for example. Then we have a limit, maybe 10 per page. Then we have here current page, for example, 1. And this is enough. And you might say, okay, we didn't really provide select page inside. This is totally fine because we're testing select page only on click, which actually means this code won't break if select page is undefined. Now what we want to do, we would like to write screen, which comes from testing library react.debug in order to see how our pagination looks like. Let's jump to the console and check what we have. As you can see, this is our UL with class pagination, and we have here a leave with class page item active, and it is active because this is our first page. And inside we have a span with class page link and 1. Now here we have 2, 3, 4, and 5, which actually means this is how our component looks like. Now we need to cover it with test. And actually here we already have on our li data test ID attribute, so we can write this test here. We can write expect screen dot get by test ID, just like we used previously, but it will be different. Why is that? Because here we're rendering a list of these lists. We're not looking for one single element. This is why here we need to write not get by test ID, but get all by test ID. And instead of one element, we will find an array. This is similar to document query and document query all. And inside I want to provide page container. Now here we have two possible variants. We want to check how many elements we have in our DOM. We can write here dot length, because these are simply DOM nodes, and check here to equal 1. And essentially we don't have one page because I want my test to break. Let's have a look. Here we're getting 5 pages and not 1. This is totally correct. We can change it to 5. As you can see, our test is green. But we can write it also differently. We can remove here length, and we can write here to have length, and here we're providing 5. As you can see, it works in exactly the same way. You can use both variants. Now I want to copy paste this line because I want to check the content at least inside one element. So this is an array and we want to get a first element, so it is 0th element. And here we can use a function that we already know to have text content. And inside we can provide 1. As you can see, our test is still green because the first page has inside content 1. But here you might say, okay, we're duplicating our code, we're getting elements twice. This is totally fine. We can improve that by creating a variable, for example, page containers, and here we're assigning this selector. Now we can use page containers inside our first selection and second selection. As you can see, our code is still green, but now we have a nice variable which we used inside our expects. So we successfully tested our props and if our component renders stuff correctly. But now we must test an event, because as you can see here, we have on click event select page and it must call a prop that we are passing inside. This is exactly what we are missing. This is why here I want to create one more test and let's name it, it should emit clicked page, which actually means we're handling here our click. Now here I will copy paste this render completely, but it should be a little bit different. This time we must provide inside select page. The question is what exactly we want to provide as select page. Will it be an empty function? Not really. We want to know if user calls something or not. And in order to do that, we can create here a handle click, which will be v.fn. What is v.fn? As you can see, v is coming from Vitest and fn is just a function. So what is fn? This is just some mocked function that is coming from Vitest and we can check later if it was called or not. So essentially you can think about this as our custom function. It is similar to just writing something like this and then making some check inside. So here we have handle click and now we can pass inside our select page property where inside we have handle click. What we want to do now, we want to click on our first li that we rendered and check that this handle click outside was really called. How can we do that? There is a special setup inside React testing library to do that. First of all, inside our it, we must write that we have a user property and we're writing here user event. As you can see, it is coming from testing library user event. This is this additional library for testing user interactions. And here we're writing .setup. As you can see in the description, setup starts a session of user events, which essentially means for every single test where you want inside to use user event, it is recommended to write at the beginning user event setup. Now after our render, we can write await user.click, and inside we are providing an element on which we want to click. What I want to do, I want to copy this line that we have here on the top with page containers and put it here after render. Now here we can say that we're clicking on our first li, so it will be page container 0. And it is extremely important to use await keyword because all interactions are asynchronous. Without await keyword, it won't wait for the click and then your test won't be successful. But as we're using await, we must create our function as a sync. And after this, what we want to do, we need to write an expectation that our handle click function was called once, so to have been called once. So what it does, it checks that after click event, this function that we passed inside, it was handle click, this is our callback of select page, was clicked. And as you can see, we are not really calling this function or checking some variable, but we have a possibility through Vitest to check that this function was called, which actually means inside our pagination we are passing VFN inside select page. Here we're simulating click on our li. This happens, we're providing a page inside, and it is coming here. Let's check if it's working. As you can see, our test is green. But what will happen if here inside we're removing this click event completely? As you can see, our test is red because we didn't click, and here expected spy to be called once but got 0 times. So our spy was not called at all. This is why let's revert this code and improve it even more. It is really nice that our handle click works, but we didn't really test that we got a correct value inside. This is why here we can write to have been called with. And in this case, we can check what was passed inside. I want to write here a string foo to compare what we are getting. As you can see, we got here 1, which is correct. This is our first page, and not a string foo. This is why here we must say, okay, our handle click was called with the parameter 1. So most important part to remember here, if you are using some user interactions, you first must call setup, then you might want to create a function from Vitest in order to handle some callback. Then when you are doing your click, you need an await. If I am removing here await, you can see that our test is red and this function was not called at all. This is why await is a must. And after this, we can use to have been called with, which is extremely nice function in order to know with which parameters our function was called. And this was the end of the first chapter. If you want to dive deeper into learning React testing, make sure to check a link in the description to the full course.